right, peace family. This is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is another installment of In Search of Black Power. For those who follow our work, this is one of our intellectual innovations where we try to provide some deep analysis on areas of focus of things that we work on, and on occasion bring folks that we work with and partners of ours to invite them to conversations to just generally deepen our analysis. And so today we have, my sister, a good friend of mine, Danielle Terrain, who's going to talk with us about, flows of capital, right? And the relationship between that and Black liberation. So what I want to do first, Danielle, thanks for, being on the podcast, first
Thanks for
time on,
having
won't
me.
be the last. Yeah.
Yep, I
Uh,
appreciate it.
Yeah. And so let's first, before, because I'm gonna intro just generally, the direction of the conversation we're gonna have. But if you can just start, just introducing yourself, where you from, just some formative aspects of your development professionally,
Mm-hmm.
and things that you would describe as formative in your, development of your perspective and worldview. So you can start there.
Oh, sure. So, Davon, always a pleasure. Thank you. And I'm excited about this conversation. I think that this is an important conversation to have. And we've been talking about this for years. Just gradually kind of unpacking the complexities of this. It's really, really important for more folks to be informed about what capital is and how it flows so that we know what to advocate for. So I just want to say thank you and just express my gratitude for creating this space. Um, I would say, in terms of my own background, worldview, and trajectory in this work, I would say, in terms of a general theme first, that a lot of my work has been about bringing meaningful investment to our communities, while also supporting other leaders as they even think about ways of building Black wealth and community wealth, and also meaningful assets, and raising the quality of investment in our communities, and over time, I've done that in a variety of different ways, probably before I even had the language, quite honestly, to really recognize that this was an entire body of work, which we can talk about. But I've approached it from the lens of policy, practice, grant making, boardroom advocacy, so to speak, and even now working more as a coach and advisor to other leaders and working in a variety of capacities who are really thinking about their own strategy, their own kind of change management as they think about like ways of leading institutions in this work, and the long game, right? We'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, about the larger context and how difficult it's become for a lot of leaders in this work and what that means in terms of what to pay attention to. And I would also say, just important to me to always recognize that there's an element of this work that has grown for me around really wanting to shift our relationship to resource as a community, and really shift our orientation and mindset around resource from one of scarcity, which has its reasons for why it shows up, to one of abundance and also control and greater agency around the resources and range of resources that we need. And I would say, in terms of my own professional trajectory, it's probably a non-traditional way of kind of responding to it, but it's really I think it's important to recognize that my origin in this work and kind of principles in this work really start with family and upbringing, and also a combination of that and spiritual principle, which I think important to recognize, which folks probably don't realize, just based on whatever, position I'm holding at a particular time. But in terms of starting with family, I think it's important to recognize that, I came from a home with two parents that were really, really serious about the work of raising a Black family. And I came from two parents that were really serious about raising children that felt uh, proud to be who they were, healthy, whole, and also free to be whatever we chose to be. And I start there because growing up, I remember being kind of aware of the level of consciousness that required the fight to protect a Black family, the intentionality around creating a space that felt supportive and loving and well-resourced, and also the intentionality of parents to also connect us with other caring adults that also poured into us and were a part of what we recognize as our community fabric. I start there because when we talk about community investment, for me, one important view is that the family, for me, is actually probably the single most important institution as we think about economic infrastructure. And we think, and also as we think about brokers of access and resource, the family, especially in this context, the Black family is really important to recognize, and it's a part of what I look for. I also raised the note of family because there were also principles. Like there were some teachings in our home, and one in many of our homes is like, all right, you've got some gifts. Those gifts aren't just for you. Those gifts are also for the benefit of your larger collective, your larger community, and larger humanity. And so there's a responsibility as folks pour into you that you also pour into others, right? And that was my first orientation with this notion of reinvestment, right? And so as we continue to progress forward, how we also reaching back and kind of looking for other folks. And so I think important to recognize. So that was like one source of grounding. And I think also like in terms of general spiritual principles, like, I just believe like each of us is here for a divine reason and purpose. And I believe that in our journeys in life, we're going to experience many different blocks to actualizing that sense of purpose, right? And some of those blocks may be structural, some of them are cultural, some of those are spiritual and internalized, some of them are environmental. But I believe that it is the role of the larger community and collective to help us to see our gifts, but also to create the conditions that allow us to bring those gifts through and to properly steward those gifts to not only benefit ourselves, but our larger community. I raise it also because I see my work is playing one small role, and each of us is playing an important role in holding that responsibility for each other, right? So when we think about the work of resourcing, it is also kind of paying attention to what do we need? What's this child's gift? What's this person's gift? What's their vision? And how do we create the container, the conditions that they need in order to bring that through? Because once they bring that through, that's going to benefit us all, right? So that's an important part of the work. That's important part of the frame. So, and then I think just who I am as a person, even as a kid, I just love to see people thrive. And I, want to see our community to thrive and kind of operate from that space of abundance. And I think that that's important. So over time, I've channeled that passion and that kind of focus in a lot of different ways. And so you've seen me move through like spaces of philanthropy and government and kind of community-based work and everywhere in between. And now in kind of more of the private sector, but as a consultant and advisors to other, right? But anywhere I've sat, the work is really to pay attention to what is it that we need? What is it that our leaders are trying to accomplish? And how do we pull on multiple levers to make that possible, even in the midst of imperfect systems, right? And the limitations of our current systemic context, which is important to recognize. But how do we make sure, however possible, that we have what we need? I also think it's important to recognize that I've learned a lot. There have been a lot of challenges in the work. I've learned and seen a lot around what is healthy in the work and what is not. Right. And I think it's important to first recognize learnings around like what it really looks like and feels like for leaders on the ground who are navigating funding systems. I started writing grants before I ever really knew that the space of philanthropy and community investment existed. And I remember firsthand the experience of working with and working for organizations and having that experience of a sudden funding shift, and you got to let folks go, and when you're doing that work in kind of a deep community context, there's a concern for the community as you also are making these decisions around how to resource people in their work, the work that they're doing. I also have seen and learned a lot about how truly disconnected the funding world can be from truly recognizing the richness of community assets and systems that already exist. And I would say, just because it's off of your radar doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Just because it is on your radar doesn't mean that it's good and investment worthy, right? but often the mistake that we make in spaces of kind of funding is that we assume that we see it all. And when there's that disconnect, we can actually do a lot of harm in how we drive investment. And so that has been an important learning, that all investment is not necessarily good investment. And if investment is not stewarded and managed and directed in ways that are really grounded in the perspectives of those who are living the experience out, there's a disconnect, and that could do a lot of harm and a lot of damage. Last thing I'll say is that I've learned a lot about the mechanics of investment, and also the cost, the disproportionate cost of moving capital in different ways. And I'll say, in terms of personal story, it wasn't until I had the experience of like carrying my child while sunsetting OSI that I realized more acutely like how costly the work can be, especially for Black women who are navigating these spaces and these different systems. And so that heightened my sensitivity to and my attention around leadership and what moving capital and resource takes, and making sure that we actually pay attention to that as we think about what we're building, how we're building, and who shows up where in that work.
And when you
So
say sunsetting OSI, you're talking about sunsetting OSI Baltimore.
OSI Baltimore,
Just for the
exactly.
people who wouldn't know. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the context is that the sunset of OSI Baltimore was kind of on the front end, the earlier end of a lot of transitions across the philanthropic sector. So the sunset of OSI Baltimore is a part of a global restructuring, but now we're also seeing many different foundations and philanthropic entities go through similar challenges, if not sunsetting, definitely deep evolutions and changes, right? And so it's like, paying attention to the cost of that work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. So, one of the things about wanting to have this conversation with you on this platform, because, this podcast is hosted on Black Liberation Media's page as a part of their collective.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the people who are regular listeners of the podcast and of the channel identify as leftist, as radical, right? And all the different flavors that you can imagine. And so for me, one of the things that grounds much of the conversation that LBS engages in that space can be characterized by the fact that when you think about the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s, one of the reflections that many folks have made in movement space about what happened then was that a lot of folks that were engaged in movement work withdrew from engaging mainstream institutions, and in many ways and in some ways withdrew from engaging the political arena. And that withdrawal was based on the notion of, wanting to upend the entire system, but doing it in a way that a lot of ways was very isolationist, right? And there's a way that the residuals of that withdrawal, I think, remains in much of the ideological battles that happen on the left in a variety of parts on the political spectrum. So for me, one important part of wanting to have this conversation with you is because those of us that have radical political sensibilities, and my critiques of folks that I would describe as aligned with the worldview that I navigate with, is that there isn't enough desire and focus on understanding the systems that our community has to navigate and figure out how to deliver in the context of the system that we're in, to then create a context where we can have more revolutionary political movements, right? So that's, like, in a lot of ways, the context. So when I think about what you've laid out in terms of, both perspective and your experience, you lay out a relationship to navigating many of these systems in ways that has our community in mind, but understands the importance of having to engage these systems, right, on terms that are most beneficial for our community. So when you think about, and you started to talk a little bit about this in terms of challenges that you've observed in terms of investments, both public and private, in our community, what are general challenges that you would want to lift up? And again, keeping in mind the nature of the kind of audience that I described, Like,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the challenges that that kind of audience should be aware of?
Mm-hmm.
And why is that particularly important for people who see themselves engaged in social movements? Because there's a version of this question where it's like,
Mm.
how can I get money? How can I get my people hooked up? Right.
Yep.
But the version of conversation we're trying to have is like, this is en route to liberation for our community. Right. So
Absolutely.
those challenges that you would identify, both public and private, in terms of access to capital, again, why is that important from a social movement perspective?
Yeah, I imagine we'll talk about this more, but I think important to recognize that embracing a range of perspectives on this is healthy, right? And we have often talked about the work of reconciling with the here and now, like where are we situated now, but where do we want to go, right? And what is it going to take to get there? Well, there's a process by which to get to where we need to go. So even if I recognize that, especially in the context of the current political moment, what we're seeing happen nationally, globally, there's and also what we're seeing with like our land, our environment, right? Like we're seeing like very real manifestations of the consequence of extractive economic systems, which have their root in capitalism. And so much there. I think that it's important that even if we know that it has to change, that we have to embrace that there is a process that has to occur to facilitate that transition. We have to take care of our folks as we facilitate that transition. And we also have to play multiple and varied roles. I think often the barrier is that we don't always have these safe spaces in which to have this conversation, to be like, wait a minute, we actually are on the same page. I may be playing a different role. I remember our conversations. I may be situated in philanthropy now, but let me be clear that I don't actually see philanthropy as a solution. I see my role as moving capital out to those that are at the ground level, that are working from a different view, that can actually build community wealth, that can build for the long term. But we need to be on the same page that that is the end goal. Philanthropy absent, that focus on building independent wealth and building from a more self-determined perspective isn't going to take us anywhere, right? So I just think that that's important to recognize that we need that space to have those conversations and also recognize and reconcile some of those tensions. We also have to recognize that sometimes we won't fully reconcile those tensions, and that's okay. Sometimes in love, like we can actually sit in the tensions and recognize that they just sometimes have to sit together. Like, I want to make sure that our folks are eating right now. I want to make sure that our folks are able to take care of these babies and our families like right now. I want to make sure that our activists and those who are on the front lines actually have what they need to take care of themselves and actually show up in healthier ways around the work. So what is my role? What role can I play? What's my responsibility and commitment in that? So I just want to share that in terms of like a general view on that dialogue, because I think it's important, right? Um, in terms of challenges right now, in terms of to access, I think that there are a couple that are much larger conversations, but a couple things to note. One is the political. People talk about the political moment. I don't think that it is just a moment. It never has been. But the political context in which we're operating, we are seeing the systemic dismantling of a lot of the vehicles that we previously had that help us to facilitate access to capital. Now I recognize that they were imperfect, deeply flawed, in many cases deeply dysfunctional, but even those vehicles are being dismantled, right? And so we actually have to think about that when we think about the major attacks on race explicit strategy. And I come from the frame of investing and grant making. Right now, litigation is being used as a tool to really suppress and really eradicate any attempt to move capital in responsive ways, and especially ways that work through a very explicit racial justice commitment. There's also a range of other tactics that are being used, from intimidation to kind of the use of media to really hurt the ability of folks to move capital in these ways. So we see a growing weaponization of language in this current context that has become deeply problematic. We also see the dismantling of a lot of infrastructure, kind of the agency structures, the institutional structures that actually give us the ability to move capital in responsive ways. We also see on the public side major cuts to public resource, which will translate into like very real disruptions of service. That will be what our people see first, but also we should know that that means that when those kind of lines of resource are cut, that also cuts funding for other forward-facing kind of strategies as well. So we know that these public funding cuts are impacting anywhere from Medicaid, infrastructure, education, housing, even public media, right? And so that is also happening very quickly, right, in a very volatile climate. On the philanthropic side, what we are also seeing is a lot of foundations like slowing, contracting, or kind of removing their commitments to racial justice work. I generalize, but there are some exceptions. But generally, the trend is that foundations are slowing down as they also are facing the risk of legal pressures and other pressures, kind of placed on foundations. And then at the local, kind of hyper local level, regardless of where you are, I think also nationally, we're seeing an intentional kind of destabilization of community based infrastructure, right? And so intentional pressure placed on those community based organizations that are important brokers of access, right? And again, the challenges are multiple. So there are like legal, strategic, political pressures, tactical. And I also think it's important to take note of for Black leaders, particularly, there's the tactic of the mental, emotional, kind of spiritual toll that the work takes, and intentionally like exhausting folks and to the point that they're tapping out. So these are very real challenges and things to pay attention to. It's specific to the DMV region. I think that it's also worth noting as we think about what's happening in terms of our larger economy, the mass layoff of federal workers. I named this because of, I started with a note around family. And one takeaway I hope that folks have from this is that alternative means of moving capital and reaching back for many of those practices that have been a part of our legacy as Black people are going to become more and more important in these times. However, when you think about family structures, if you intentionally target and attack that segment of a community that has access, that is usually the node from which we redistribute many other resources through our families and our kind of informal or formal kind of community structures, that becomes deeply problematic. So when you think about the most wealthy Black counties in the country being situated around the DMV, 1 in 5 of those workers being employed with the federal government, the mass and targeted layoff of those Black workers, and the ripple effect that will be felt from that is something to really, really pay attention to, because not only does it impact the economic stability of the home, it also impacts the ability of those folks to give in informal ways to their loved ones, and also to make sure that the larger collective is taken care of. So we really need to think about what's happening both in terms of our homes and how that is really going to impact a larger kind of economic resilience and in this time. So, why does it matter to social movements? I think one, these are things to pay attention to. So when we are thinking about the prioritization of issue, we can't abandon this work around capital access and also the proper infrastructure that we need to move resources to our folks in responsive ways, right? So when we're thinking about what to advocate for, this has to be a priority. We also need to think about alternative systems of resourcing and care, right? So I mentioned our legacy of mutual aid and kind of those support networks. That becomes more and more important. Cooperative structures, land trust, right? Really thinking about ways of building our community wealth in alternative ways, but also building vehicles of reinvestment that allow us to really control capital and move capital in ways that are germane to like our own kind of culture and values, but also help us to get resources to where they're most needed. The last thing I'll note is like the kind of note of healing, and we've talked about this. The level of trauma that occurs in our community within the context of this issue of economic access, and the need to really deepen partnerships with our healers, our practitioners that can actually hold that space and help us to restore and repair the harm that is done by virtue of many of these economic systems. And as we think about the broader kind of destabilization of things in this political climate and the impact on people, like that lens around healing is actually going to be really important as well.
And that's actually a good segue. One of the things that LBS's critique of certain elements of the progressive movement and of the left, of which central to it is economic redistribution, is the absence, from progressives and other leftists, the absence of the importance of investing in the capacity for Black people in this context to practice sovereignty and self-determination.
Yeah.
And one of the concepts that you and I have talked about over many years, and it'll be good in this context to really try to break it down, is this notion of an intermediary and intermediary structures. Because as you mentioned before, given the destabilization of the existing vehicles of moving resources, many of them being problematic, in some ways, this may present an opportunity for us to think about what it looks like to build alternative machinery, these kind of intermediary structures, such that we have greater capacity for the kind of mutual aid and more direct distribution of resources. So if you can break down the concept of an intermediary, and I guess in addition to what I just mentioned, like why that is so central for moving in the direction of Black liberation.
Absolutely. So intermediary is like one of those terms that sound like really technical, but we're trying to drill it down to a few experiences that I think we often have. Intermediaries actually show up in our communities in a variety of different ways. We just often don't use that language or make the connection in ways that allow us to systematize, to really think about the intentional kind of building of this type of infrastructure, and and also thinking about why it's important. So as we think about what an intermediary is, it is a part of a broader set of community economic infrastructure, right? And when I talk about community economic infrastructure, I'm talking about the mix of physical, institutional, financial, and social capacities that are required to move resource and capital in responsive ways. So I'll give a few examples. Like when I talk about physical elements of economic infrastructure, we're talking about the built environment. So you're talking about spaces, bricks and mortar, like the places that we have to go to. We're talking even about access to broadband internet, or even transportation systems that allow us to move resources in a variety of different ways at the macro level, right? When we talk about the institutional element, we think about a range of different organizations and programs, such as workforce training programs and big business incubators, right? Those institutions that help to anchor a range of programmatic and other approaches that help us to train folks up and educate folks, as one example. So that's the institutional element. Financial, I think we should think about our systems of banking, community development financing institutions, community development corporations, right? And cooperatives, even like the vehicles that we have for actual investment, and to facilitate kind of financial transactions. And then last, which is often left out, but really important, is the social element of economic infrastructure, which is the relationship between people, networks of trust, the cultural elements. And these are the intangibles that have everything to do with how we access resource and our ability to kind of connect the dots. And so when we think about the importance of people, their leadership, neighborhood associations, they also play an important part in this kind of broader set of capacities and institutions that we need to move resources in responsive ways. So when you think about economic infrastructure, community economic infrastructure, they all support larger economic growth, wealth building. They support community economic resilience. So when we think about flashpoints, pandemic, COVID-19, economic recessions, a strong economic infrastructure helps us to buttress ourselves, to protect ourselves against these important moments that can put our community under a lot of stress, economic stress and strain. I mentioned wealth building, but also I want to mention also the place-based economic development element, but rooted in our own kind of sense of identity and kind of culture, right? So when we think about economic infrastructure, it should be aligned with who we are as people and also rooted in our own sense of values and culture, right? So not an abstract, this is really kind of bringing it home. So when you think about an intermediary fits under that umbrella. It's a type of economic infrastructure, and it's a middle entity, right? So what's unique is that we have organizations that sit between the funding world and our world of community-based entities and organizations and leaders. An intermediary's role is to play middle in that they raise resources on one end, and their responsibility is to move resources back out in ways that get resources to where they're most needed. And as we think about agenda, the overlay, it should help us to effectively accomplish whatever it is we've set out to do, right? So moving resources for the sake of resources is no good. It actually has to be combined with a very clear sense of strategy, direction, and what we're trying to build, right? So an intermediary should work within a frame of in a strategy or agenda, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we talk about intermediaries as backbone entities. They sometimes play a role in kind of managing and coordinating a lot of different things. But there are a couple of key functions that I want folks to like look for in these types of entities. One, it's like, again, raising and sometimes pooling funds, also regranting funds back out. Sometimes these are entities that provide capacity support. So when you think about yourself as maybe someone who is trying to attract investment, kind of think about the right investment, a strong intermediary is a trusted partner to also broker access to that advisement and support that you need to clarify those goals, and also to receive and steward the capital that you need to effectively accomplish your goals. And sometimes intermediaries also play a role in tracking data across the network so that we can see things from a macro view. And then they also sometimes play a role in advocacy. So again, if you have your kind of a pulse on where a community is and what it needs in terms of resource, there's a responsibility there to lift that up in ways that push the world of policy and also elevate those needs so that to align outside investment to the needs of that particular community. So intermediaries vary in their issue focus, geographic focus. You'll see some intermediaries focus on specific populations. So in this conversation, we're talking about the Black community. We're here in Baltimore. So we should think concretely about, well, what are our intermediary institutions serving the interests of Black people in Baltimore in our context, right? What you'll notice is that we often, within the context of the Black community, have a very limited bench, right, of institutions to choose from. And that ain't right. You know, in other contexts, you have the ability to lean into consumer choice. I can find a range of different options to meet my values, my philosophies, my personal philosophies and ideology, my needs, my technical needs, and I can actually choose what type of financial institution I want to work with to steward investment or to help me to attract and receive the investment I need. However, in the context of our community, we're often limited. You know, if we have one, it hasn't been properly invested in to be strong enough to really meet the range of needs of demands of our communities. And this is when you see our economic infrastructure fail and cause a lot of confusion and hurt and pain. But often there's an issue of proper investment on the front end. The last thing I'll note in terms of what an intermediary is and is not is that we talk about fiscal hosting entities. They sometimes include that function, but a fiscal host is an organization that is a 501c3 that lends its legal status to basically take another initiative or project on. So when you're working with a fiscal host, you're actually working within their legal structure to move your work, right? That's kind of, sometimes you have an intermediary that's inclusive of that function, but a fiscal hosting entity can be a standalone. An intermediary is also different from a foundation in that a foundation is usually endowed. Like there's a person or a set of resources that have been used to actually create an entity, and its sole focus is really on getting the money out. Intermediary works with funders and foundations to pool capital. It is not a foundation, right? So that was like kind of a more technical definition, but I want to kind of bring it home and say that in our a lot of times in our communities, we've had people for a very long time serve in intermediary roles informally, but probably go without that recognition when we think about places of faith, when we think about family structures. Usually there is somebody or some group of people that have made it their business to tap the family or kind of tap the community to say, hey, let's pool some resources here. Let's move those resources back out to folks that need it. And so I want us to recognize that, because I think that these are practices that are already that we already kind of see within our community context. We think about food pantries, susus, giving circles, pool funds for emergencies. Let's just pool a couple funds so that when somebody needs something, we can move that back out and in a way that honors their dignity. When you think about folks who often are trusted to play those capacities, there are a couple of qualities they usually have. One, they're in deep relationship. They're known, right? Two, they are trusted. They're trusted as an entity. I trust you to effectively steward these funds. I trust you to like pull them together and house them somewhere that I know that they'll be taken care of. And they also have the ability to move those resources back out to folks in responsive ways. They know their community. When we think about institutions, the function should be no different, right? So a well-functioning intermediary should be deeply ingrained in the community that it is working with and for. It should be trusted. It also should have the requisite capacities to move resources back out in ways that feel accountable and transparent, right? And aligned with principle. So I think it's important to like bring it home and really think about those folks in our midst that have always been playing these functions, right? The work is to now build more infrastructure and kind of take that to the next level so that we can move more resources at greater scale for our community. So, I just want to close that by saying, like, why does this matter? I get that question a lot where it's just like, yeah, I don't want to really talk about that. Like, why does it matter? One, I just want to drive home consumer choice. We should have the ability to choose. We should have more institutions that represent our interests. They should be strong, right? And that is an intentional work. We also need to make sure that our institutions have the mixture of technical and adaptive capacities to really be accountable to us and work in the ways that feel healthy. So there are things that we have to look for in building our organizations in this work. It's legal capacity, it's the operational capacity. When I say adaptive, it's the relational and culture, like how do they work? How do they actually show up? And in this more challenged political environment, it's also the policy at the political and kind of policy related acumen. Either the intermediary needs to have that in-house or be deeply partnered with folks that can read the political kind of environment so that they can keep up with, different elements of risk and effectively navigate to bring resources to our folks. So yeah, like I think that hopefully that definition helps, as we think about like what an intermediary is.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent breakdown, and And one of the things I want to emphasize from what you were saying is just the importance of having the capacity to be intentional about the
Mm-hmm.
distribution of resources, right? And I think your breakdown helps to illuminate all the different facets of those considerations and ways that, and you and I have talked about this in the past, where people will just say, oh, let's just give people the money, like just hand
Yeah.
out the money, right?
Yeah.
And it's important for people to have a sense of when we're talking about empowering a community, because that makes sense if you're talking about an individual person. But
Yeah.
if you're talking about empowering a community, all the considerations that you just laid out are essential in being able to do it. And that actually ties into, there is, as I've mentioned several times in this conversation, the context of this podcast, where those who are listening to it generally have leftist
Mm-hmm.
ideological commitments,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like socialism being among them, right? Understanding
Yeah.
that, or at the very least, anti-capitalist in terms of
Mm-hmm.
people's perspective and worldview. And there's a way, even in my own conversations, the way that I've had conversations with leftists where conversations about capital flows are equated to, a commitment to capitalism, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and and I and what I don't think happens enough are people who are
Mm-hmm.
situated in context where they are helping to steer distribution of resources. There's enough. I don't think there's enough examples of folks talking about that work from an explicitly like anti-capitalist, revolutionary perspective and worldview. And you kind of set it up earlier when you were saying like, yeah, we can have a sense of where we want to go. We got to know where we're situated at right now.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say to people who have that kind of leftist socialist commitment, but might be struggling with the fact that in engaging the systems as they exist right now, you got to talk about the existing system, right? And that engaging the
Mm-hmm.
existing system doesn't necessarily mean that you're committed to the system as it exists. What would you say to a person that would raise that?
Honestly, Davon, I would say exactly that. It is that to engage with the system doesn't necessarily mean that that you believe that the system is it, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a that conversation or that acknowledgement requires a level of nuance in really acknowledging that I can um, uh, work with a recognition that something has to change, but also sit in the work of moving it from its current kind of place, right? I can recognize that the system is fraught and not serving us, and also recognize that somebody's got to dismantle the current thing, or someone has to hold the line relative to the current system to make sure that it's not continuing to harm us as we continue to protect the space to build anew. And I think that there's something around, like, again, playing these different roles and recognizing that these different roles and ways in which we are positioned around this issue are all necessary. But we have to like take it to the next level to make sure that we're really working in concert and complement. Right now, often and I've experienced this a lot in this work where it's like an either or. It's
Mm-hmm.
like either you step outside of the system and disengage, or there's pretty much nothing else, and it's like, well, tell me, what do we do in the meantime, you know? And when
Mm-hmm.
we think about the scale of the issue in terms of like the current economic system, the current culture around that, it is going to take time and intentionality to move away from that. I also think it's important to recognize that it is important for us to play multiple and varied roles. So I could work for the foundation. I could also recognize that it's important to have folks on the ground advocating and pushing the system as I'm even situated in the system. There's no way for us to like hold the institution accountable without there being an outside voice, like kind of pushing. And so I think sometimes it's those types of perspectives don't always um, aren't always fully understood. That there couldn't be leaders situated in that way that fully recognize the value of kind of stepping outside. So I think, Davon, what I would say is like I can fully honor the fact that there are different roles to play, and then there's an overlay of time, and that will hopefully change and shift over time. I can completely appreciate those who will say, you know what, my role is to step outside of the system and disengage. For me, those are the folks who are modeling what is possible and testing what is possible. They are kind of creating where we will ideally go, right? I also can understand those who are kind of advocating and kind of pushing what is, just as I can understand some of those who are working within the system to move resources out so that we can actually resource some of what we need. And, everyone may not agree with that perspective, but that is my own. And that's kind of the lens from which I've done a lot of work. Again, I mentioned like the example of working for government or philanthropy to say, I can be situated in those spaces, moving resources out, but with the understanding and the hope that y'all are going to do something different with these resources, with a different game plan, build those community-based enterprises, think about cooperative structures, think about these issues of self-determination and ownership, make sure that we're building with a generational lens, right? Make sure that we're carefully thinking about what the alternative economic model is and what it means to facilitate that transition. But I'm going to play this role here as long as I can. I also think it's important to recognize that when we do see folks kind of working within the system, recognize that increasingly their terms are short, right? It's rare that you see someone aligned with this perspective stay for long. And I usually try to be clear around that. I may have 3 or 4 years, maybe 5, right? And within the bounds of that timeline, here's what we're trying to accomplish, right? And it's important to have that safe space to acknowledge that and to be able to see when people are stepping in and stepping out for that purpose, so that we can be really strategic about the highest and best use of our time and our collective resource, right? So those are some of my
Mm-hmm.
responses, Davon.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
that's really good, and I think it's really good to have that on the record, particularly again in this context, because again, like you and I have talked about that. We may
yeah,
have private
yeah.
conversations with people about that, but I think it's really good in this particular context for people to hear that perspective and wrestle with it. And then lastly, um, I think when conversations around economic redistribution and
Mm-hmm.
the importance of getting resources to our community, and as you laid out, when you kind of laid out the piece around what is an intermediary, the kind of ecosystem of institutions and whatnot. So for some people, that it's complex, right?
Yeah.
And people who
Mm-hmm.
listen to this will probably have to do some additional studying in terms of really getting a grasp of that. What are some things that you would say are important for
Mm-hmm.
advocates to advocate for or build, in kind of the short intermediate term? Like what are some particular efforts or initiatives or structures, um, that for you are things that in terms of advancing redistribution of resources to our community, um, what are some of those pieces of advocacy or things we should be
Mm-hmm.
building toward that in?
Yeah, there are a couple things that come to mind. One, kind of bridging from even the last topic, I would say, safe space for this kind of education is important because this is like the tip of the iceberg, right? But I do
Mm-hmm.
recognize that, for many of these are like complex topics. I mean, like even conversations with my family, they're like, "What is it that you do?" And
Mm-hmm.
what, like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, say that again. And that some of that is by design. Like these are concepts that have been kind of kept from us, right? And so recognizing that it will be a process of like really getting oriented and kind of comfortable with holding like these economic concepts, but then also like unpacking them to be on the same page in terms of what we mean and what we're working toward, and then getting to a space of like collective strategy development and movement around this, right? So like I would say first, like that space, continue to advocate for, look for that space for education and in a way that broadens our definition. It really redefines what we mean by capital, right? Sometimes the limitation in this work is that the language that we're using is comes from outside of our community context, right? And immediately, like that shuts many of us down. I've even acknowledged within the course of this conversation that language is a challenge Like, will they truly hear me because the language sounds like something else? How do we really describe what it is that we're trying to accomplish, and the fact that we're actually aligned? So when we think about capital, when we think about the work around resource, I want us to really think about it within the context, the specific context of the Black community, and all of the different ways that we actually think about what resource is. I started with family and community because our people are our most important resource, right? So thinking about human capital, our spiritual currency as a people is a real thing, our cultural currency, and all of the things that are extracted from us and misused in the current system, in addition to financial capital and labor. I think it's important to broaden those definitions. The other thing is, I think it's important to advocate for space and time to build. We often talk about the fact that when there has been an opportunity for deeper investment, it usually is at a time of crisis, and the stakes are really high, the timelines are very short, and the tolerance for the work of building is not there, right? And, again, leaning into nuance, I can completely understand why there are frustrations, right? Like, often we'll hear from our folks, like, got to get the money out fast. You know what I mean? There's need right now. We don't have time to build a thing. But when we don't actually advocate for and protect the space to responsibly build, this is actually when we see like a pattern of this dysfunction kind of play out that is deeply hurtful and harmful to our folks. And so actually holding the line to say, nah, in other contexts, you would actually start it with a feasibility analysis, research, space to bring people together. That would have been fully resourced. Then we would have taken a year to be able to strategize, develop the plan. And I say this while completely understanding that there's a need for urgency and expediency in the work, but also that we need like the proper space to be better educated and informed about what we're building. I also think about the teachings of Audre Lorde. When we think about the master's tools, the connection between education and space is that often my concern as someone who has navigated a lot of different spaces, when I step out and am in kind of spaces with folks who have the intent to disconnect from the system, we don't even realize when we are actually replicating a lot of the practices and the structures of like kind of white supremacist kind of culture, and kind of drawing from those norms. We don't even realize sometimes how deeply ingrained that is, and how much it shapes how we're building, right? So we need that space to unpack that to make sure that when we have the intention to build anew or differently, it truly is different, and not us just replicating more of the norms and the practices of those that we're working to move away from. So I would say that I also just want to say, policy is so important. So when we think about the policy frameworks to really protect those who are most vulnerable in these times, we have to broaden the kind of view of like who even shows up in that as we think a bit about the depth of destabilization. I think that that's important. And I think all of that, as we continue to really advocate for alternative economic models. So I mentioned those cooperative structures, land trust, community-led enterprise, small business, really kind of building the base of wealth so that we have the ability to lean into like that notion of kind of self-determination and like community control of capital. So we have to really advocate for that and kind of protect that. So my hope is that we start shifting away from building in times of crisis in a reactive way to really taking a more proactive stance, right? Proactive investments, resilient institutions, thinking about from a generational arc, what do we want to pass on to the next generation, and how do we actually facilitate that transfer, and what are the range of institutions that are actually going to help us to accomplish that, right? Not just kind of functioning in the here and now, which requires a level of like deconditioning and reorientation, right? But these are some of the things that come to mind, right? Like that space, that time to properly build and to become better educated around what we're building, while also holding the line around kind of the broader policy and kind of political context, right? And what's happening to our folks and making sure that our folks are well taken care of.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent way to conclude, because I think the emphasis on investment and needing time to build so that we're not being reactive. Like, I think
Yeah.
that's such an important thing for people to understand conceptually, that in talking about investment, again, not just in addition to investing in institutions and, people that are engaged in really specific work, like the investment in the time and space it takes to actually build these proactive structures so that we can be in an agenda setting posture, right? As
Yeah.
opposed to being in a reactive posture. I think that's such an important place to conclude. So look, thanks, Danielle, for having this conversation. Hopefully this is
Anytime.
part one of many
Yeah.
conversations and in other contexts to expand on this. Again, for those listeners, it's Davon Love, Director of Public Policy Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Thanks for listening to In Search of Black Power. Peace.